So, welcome back to part two for our special topic in gangs, Mafia, from the Capone to the Teflon Don with love. So I want to thank you all for tuning in to the first part. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe so that way you'll be in the know anytime new lectures drop, as well as any other videos that I decide to upload. I will be releasing a video talking about some of my past experiences in probation, in law enforcement, just to kind of change it up just a little bit as we get the channel underway. But again, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to tune into this lecture, and I really hope that you enjoyed the first part. Now, to recap, before I jump right in, if you did not see part one, I launched this channel, Professor for the People, with the expectation that I would take the knowledge that I have accumulated within the criminal justice system and being a professor, I would take that knowledge and I would share it with everyone. I've been told before that I have a way of engaging with students, really being down to earth, but being relatable. And my style of lecture is one that a lot of students gravitate to. And that's why I launched the channel. So again, I want to humbly thank you for taking the time to subscribe, to look at videos, to like, leave comments, and just keep it right here because there will be a lot more lectures coming as we go along and as we finish out the semester, and even when we transition into the summer, which is generally very slow. But I have a lot of lectures, lots of different topics that I've lectured on that I think that you will find very engaging. So in part one, this lecture titled Mafia, from Capone to the Teflon Don with love, I spent the first lecture really talking about how Al Capone was the most notorious and infamous but popular gangster of a generation. One that even nearly 100 years later, Capone is still revered. Capone is still idolized by individuals. And we'll get to that modern mafia and the modern mobsters in just a little bit. But with that being said, I wanted to lay the foundation on, even though this is a class on gangs, I wanted to lay the foundation on how Al Capone, original gangsters, 1920s, 1930s era gangsters, really influenced the gangs that we have today. And that's why I felt like this was the most appropriate topic to start on. So with that being said, we know Capone, he thrived during the era of Prohibition, that period of time where alcohol was banned thanks to the 18th Amendment and enforced by the Volstead Act. And you saw the gangsters, primarily in Chicago, really, really thrive. So we want to pick up from there and we want to talk about modern gangsters. But before we do that, earlier in the semester, and for you all that's joining me, you wouldn't know, although you might know, I wanted to highlight, well, what are some ways someone can join a gang? What are some of the ways someone can be part of a gang? And with that being said, there are four notable ways, notable instances that someone can join a gang. The first is they can put work in. Simply put, putting in work means that you're going to commit a criminal act on behalf of the gang. Anything that you do is done on behalf of the gang. In fact, it's often referred to as the element of the crime is done for the furtherance of the gang. It's to further the gang. With that being said, you'll put in work. It might be a robbery, it could be a burglary, it could be a grand theft of a motor vehicle, it could be any number of offenses to prove your loyalty and your worth to the gang. The second one is getting jumped in or beat in. And this really ties into what I'm talking about when I say showing love. Because in gangster lore, you are shown love if you take a beating. You are shown love if they administer tough love, tough justice, so to speak. And so getting jumped in or beat in simply means that you would have to endure a test. It could be 30 seconds, it could be 60 seconds, it could be 90 seconds, but you will have to endure a physical beating, usually by anywhere from 5 to 10 gang members. And you will have to prove that you can take that beating, you can take getting jumped in. And the belief is that if we're beating on you because we love you, but also you are showing that you're a tough son of a gun and that you can handle what we can dish out because we're the baddest gang out there. So that's the second one, and that ties directly into showing love. Now, the third one is you can get blessed in. Getting blessed in is where the gang leader will endorse you, especially if they're family. Now, there's a possibility that a person could be blessed in and not be family, but it's very rare. Generally speaking, if you have a family member that's a high-ranking gang member, they can vouch for you and say, no, this person's good, or we are confident in this person's abilities. And so therefore, as a result, generally speaking, they can do what's called a blessing in. And you still will probably put some work in to show your worth. But generally speaking, because you got blessed in, to me, that's probably the easiest way to get into the game. And then we got this fourth one. And I know some of you that are watching the lecture, you might say, when I gave this lecture just last week, the reaction on one of the students' faces kind of was priceless. It's getting sexed in. In my law enforcement career, I have a detective. I haven't talked to him in a little bit, but he's done a couple of talks for some of my former students, as well as when I was in probation. And I remember distinctly this detective talked about how getting sexed in is not just for girls. It's believed that getting sexed in is for girls, but it is not just for girls. Getting sexed in absolutely can occur against boys. And most people will say, wait a minute, these gangs have a very macho mentality. These gangs have a very manly and masculine connotation. Why would they sex someone in? Well, it's very easy, because they sometimes want to see how loyal are you to the gang? How much are you willing to give up, including your body? And if you're a man willing to do that for other gang members, to them, you're worthy. So again, I wanted to kind of just tie this into showing love. Ultimately, whether you put work in, get jumped in, get blessed in, or even get sexed in, you are showing the gang an act of love. But more importantly, if you're jumped in and beaten, you're being taught physical love at the hands of the gang. So let's talk about the rise of the modern mafia. So the American Mafia was known as the Italian-American Mafia, and they rose to power during that era of prohibition, as we saw in last class. But once again, recapping, go check out the first video before watching this, or if you start watching this video, pause, rewind, and go back to the first video. That era of prohibition being a period of time where the sale of alcohol was illegal. They did not have alcohol, and you cannot sell alcohol. It was illegal. What we saw is that the mafia rose to power, and one of the key, criminal elements that the mafia engaged in order to, again, further their gang, so to speak, was they would sell alcohol. It was called bootlegging, right? Well, they also engage in other crimes: gambling, money laundering, drug trafficking, counterfeiting currency and goods, labor unit infiltration. Think about how we're talking about northeastern states, right? So we're talking about your Chicagos and Pennsylvanias and New Yorks of the world. These northeastern states have strong labor unions. Why? Because they have manufacturing jobs, right? I grew up in upstate New York. One of the most notable career fields or career paths that someone could take is working in a manufacturing plant. So they might infiltrate the union, so to speak, or the labor rather, and perhaps maybe infiltrate the flow of goods, so that way they can come in and potentially sell goods or get the manufacturer to do their own bidding. Again, it's very sneaky and underhanded, but they were so good at it. Then we also had extortion, extorting people for money, and even loan sharking. So these were just some of the numerous crimes that the mafia would engage in. So in some instances, if you double cross the mafia, you might get whacked or you'll sleep with the fishes. So first of all, let's talk about getting whacked. Getting whacked means that you're going to be taken out. Usually you will be taken out in an especially violent or sudden manner. Imagine you got people sitting around and you have individuals of the mafia. You have a Joey and you have, Antonio and you have Felipe and whoever. And then they're like, where is Marciano? Where is Giuseppe? And someone says Giuseppe got whacked or Marciano got whacked. And he's gone. He's taken out. He's no longer here. You know what that terminology means. And that's what it means. And in talking about this rise of the mafia, I wanted to convey to my students in gang mythos and gang culture, there are certain connotations and words to mean taking somebody out and not taking them out on a date. So one, to get whacked means to be taken out, especially in a violent or sudden manner. Now, if someone's saying, okay, so Giuseppe got whacked, right? Yeah. Well, where's Giuseppe now? Well, he's sleeping with the fishes. All that means is that the person has been disposed of in a body of water. So they are currently in a lake, in an ocean, in a river, in a pond, but they were whacked, they were taken out, and now that they're no longer here, their body was disposed of in a body of water. These are two terms that in mafia, when you're dealing with the mafia, when you're talking to the mob, you do not want to hear somebody that's near and dear to you got whacked. You don't want to be a son or daughter and hear that your father got whacked. You don't want to hear that your brother is sleeping with the fishes, because in mafia and mob lore, these two terms mean that that person is no longer living. They've crossed over. And that's the kind of the beauty of the danger of being associated with the mob and the mafia and gangs in general, as we'll talk about periodically throughout the rest of the semester. So the Sicilian Mafia was known as La Cosa Nostra, and they originated in Sicily in the mid-19th century. Now, La Cosa Nostra, they undertook some of the same criminal elements that the Italian-American Mafia took on. So, yes, they did loan sharking and they did, drug trafficking, but they also did some other things such as racketeering. They handled disputes between criminals. Imagine, let me just pause for a second. You know that if you go to arbitration, for example, I'm a big sports fan. Some of you that are listening or watching may be sports fans. And generally speaking, when people have a dispute with their contract, which, when people have a dispute with their contract, generally speaking, they will go to what's called arbitration. Arbitration is an opportunity for both parties to come together and try to come up with an agreement that satisfies both needs. Generally speaking, the person who signed the contract, one side will say, well, you signed this contract. And even though there may be people around you who are, far exceeding their contract, or they may not even be living up to their contract, and you far exceeded your contract, generally speaking, we need to come up with an agreement so you're not frustrated and disgruntled and we're not frustrated and disgruntled. And that's arbitration. It's just a hearing. Well, criminals do this too. And in the mafia and in the mob, since we're talking about, Sicilian mafia and Italian-American mafia, we're generally talking about very large families. We're talking about a lot of individuals with big personalities, which we will get to in a second. And having said that, sometimes criminals are going to have disputes too. So therefore, generally speaking, there will be arbitration that will be handled so that way the two criminal sides can come to an agreement, shake on it, and go about their business. Also, they want to enforce illicit agreements between criminals using threat or violence. And generally speaking, when thinking of these illicit agreements, we're talking about if you have two individuals or two sets of criminal parties where maybe one party's not properly paying the other party, or they're encroaching on the other party's territory and they were warned not to. And so if they don't stop, then what will happen is there will be violence, or there will be serious threats of violence. So having said that, La Cosa Nostra was organized by Charles Lucky Luciano in 1931, right around the time of Al Capone, and it was comprised of what was known as the Five Families. So let's talk about the Five Families, and these are the five families that make up La Cosa Nostra. Again, one of the most powerful mafia syndicates in the world. You got the Gambino crime family, the Genovese crime family, the Bonanno crime family, the Colombo crime family, and the Lucchese crime family. And these five families controlled nearly all organized crime from the 1930s to the 1990s. We're talking about 6 decades, nearly 60 years of all organized crime being controlled by these five families, powerful individuals who can say, hey, I want you to whack Tony over there because Tony is not following the rules, and you were going to go whack Tony. Or they'd make a comment and they'd say, hey, we're going to go ahead and start taxing little subgroups in this area whatever amount of money because they are operating in our territory, and we just feel like it's time to raise taxes. And they would order it, and you would have to pay it. So these five crime families were very powerful, and they really speak to just how powerful the Mafia crime family was. In fact, their dominance was so widespread, as you see. Not only did they last for 60 years, even though they're not operating at the same strength as they were back then today, but they are still active in some of your major cities. New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. These are major cities in our country, and they are still active. They're still active. It's funny, before I move on, I had a student come up to me, and she was like, yeah, professor, we were talking about the Mafia in a class. It was a different class. And she's like, I'm texting my mom about the Mafia, and lo and behold, she's got some Mafia ties. Not anything she's aware of, but her family has Mafia ties, and she is from that New York, New Jersey area. So it's real, and you never know when you might encounter someone that may be tied to the Mafia, or may have known somebody that was tied to the Mafia, or may have even gotten whacked by the Mafia. You never know. So with that being said, let's get into our second noteworthy character. We talked about Al Capone, Scarface, in the last lecture. We got to come to our next one. And the most popular and well-known boss of any crime family in modern times is the man you see right there. None other than John Gotti. So John Gotti did something that nobody would really think to do. Now, in the last lecture, I did put on my thinking cap, and I wanted you to put yours on and say, if Al Capone was Johnny Torrio's bodyguard of the Chicago outfit, how was it that Johnny Torrio was nearly assassinated by Northside Gang member hitmen, and Al Capone was nowhere to be seen, or Al Capone did not face any type of potential threat to his own life? Something seems off. Again, could be just a little bit of conspiracy, but something seems very off. And so with that being said, in this instance, when we talk about John Gotti, and I'm just going to give you the lore, and by all means, look up different videos. There's a lot of Gangland, Gangsters, America's Most Wanted, or America's Most Notorious videos out there. There's a lot of stuff you can find. John Gotti did the unthinkable. You see, John Gotti was very upset with the current boss, Paul Castellano, for not really wanting to expand La Cosa Nostra's reach and empire. See, Gotti, under his watch, Gotti was having drugs sold, and Gotti was a capo. If you remember in the last lecture, I talked about Mafia mob hierarchy, how it is very much patterned after law enforcement and military. A capo regime is a captain. So John Gotti was a captain. So he had an underboss to report to, and then he had the boss. The boss was Paul Castellano. Well, Castellano warned Gotti, hey, you're going to probably be either excommunicated or something's going to happen if you keep selling drugs because it gives us a little bit of heat. Meanwhile, Gotti loved money. And so when John Gotti did the unthinkable and he had Paul Castellano whacked, what it sent a message to the other crime families is that Gotti means business. And this is a man not to be played with. And that's why unanimously, when it was time for the 5 families to convene and vote on a new boss, John Gotti said, I'll be the new boss, and nobody pushed back. So this is the type of man John Gotti was. But in addition to having that ruthless, cutthroat mentality, again, nobody would ever think that a capo would go ahead and have their boss whacked. John Gotti was very flamboyant. John Gotti was very flashy. John Gotti loved the headlines. And that's why he had 2 notorious nicknames. The first is that he was called the Dapper Don. Why was he called the Dapper Don? Well, easily, folks, because of the suits he wore, as you see in the picture. He had very expensive clothes, very expensive suits, loved nice cars, flashy watches, jewelry, ate at some of the finest steakhouses in New York City. He'd be in front of the cameras, be very outspoken, talking to the media, again, doing something that the gang is not supposed to do, and we'll get to that as we wrap everything up. Gotti, one time, immediately someone said, that's a real nice suit you got on. It's about $1,000. You know what? Gotti got upset. Gotti said, it's not $1,000. This is an $1,800 suit. Gotti wanted you to know he was making money, he was very wealthy, and that he can walk around and sport an $1,800 suit like it was nothing. He wanted you to know that. But while he was called the Dapper Don, he also had another nickname, one that even resonates even to this day. There's a rapper, a world famous rapper, who had, I believe, an album called this, Teflon Don. Why was he called Teflon Don? Because John Gotti was acquitted in 3 high-profile trials, even though there was concrete evidence that he was responsible for the crime that was committed. Thanks to jury tampering, thanks to juror misconduct, people getting paid off, and even witness intimidation, threats that the witness would likely face an impending doom. John Gotti had the moniker of being known as the Teflon Don because you would throw charges at him and they wouldn't stick. So he had 2 very unique nicknames. Dapper Don, the expensive clothes he wore, flashy suits, larger-than-life personality, and of course, the Teflon Don because charges would not stick against him. So you might say to yourself, all right, well, Professor, what was John Gotti's undoing? Because we know with Al Capone had an undoing, and that undoing was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. What was John Gotti's undoing? It wasn't what his undoing was. It was who his undoing was. Right there. Salvatore Gravano, a.k.a. Sammy the Bull. Salvatore Gravano was John Gotti's underboss. So once John Gotti had Paul Castellano whacked, and John Gotti assumed the throne himself and became the boss of the Gambino crime family and essentially was running La Cosa Nostra, ultimately he made Sammy the Bull Gravano as his underboss. And Sammy the Bull earned that nickname and had a reputation of being a bull because he was essentially nothing more than a hitman. Even though he was an underboss, he loved violence. He was a hitman. And so apparently Gotti felt like, despite the fact that Sammy the Bull was doing a lot of his bidding, Gotti felt that it was noteworthy or needed to disrespect Sammy the Bull, which is something you don't do in any gang, but certainly you don't do it when it comes to the mafia or the mob. Even if you're the boss, yes, you may have the power of life and death in your hands, but you don't disrespect someone that is very close to you, like your consigliere, your right hand, or your underboss, because generally speaking, they're going to have the most inside, intimate knowledge of you than anybody within the criminal organization. So, yes, Gotti was making millions of dollars, $20 million a year, living life, living fat off the land, as they would say. But Gravano aided the FBI in convicting Gotti, rather, because Gotti was heard on a wiretap talking about how Gravano wasn't anything, he wasn't nothing, he's a nobody, all these things, disrespect. And Gravano felt that because Gotti betrayed him, this was the last straw. And so what happened? He flipped. He flipped. And because he heard that wiretap, he said, I'll tell you everything you need to know so you can nail this guy. This time, the charges will stick. Let me tell you something. If you remember back to the last lecture, the irony with Al Capone, again, the most notorious and infamous and well-known mobsters of a generation. Al Capone did not go to prison for whacking people. He did not go to prison for the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He did not go to prison for how many people he may have had sleeping with the fishes. You know why Al Capone went to prison? Tax evasion. That's it. And he only got 11 years. John Gotti was not going to be so lucky. The FBI and the federal government, who was prosecuting John Gotti, they weren't going to let what happened in the 1930s, 20s and 30s with Al Capone happen to our modern day generation, most notorious gangster, and John Gotti. And so as you see right here, because Gravano flipped, again, did something that nobody thought would happen. Gotti was convicted of 5 murders, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and even extortion. He got life in federal prison. And John Gotti met his demise in 2002 due to throat cancer. Now, Sammy the Bull, he did do some prison time, but he had essentially almost full immunity. Not quite, but he almost had full immunity. And after he served his brief prison sentence, he ended up going into witness protection. But hey, he's a tough guy, right? He decided to leave. And right now, he has quite the following on social media. So, you can look him up on a lot of different social media channels. And I'm not sure if he talks about all of his time being in the mob and in the mafia, but he's still out there. And so far, he has not been whacked. But Sammy the Bull did something that is a great way to close this lecture. And it's important to close it when looking at what's called the Code of Silence. Because what is the Code of Silence? Generally speaking, when you're talking about the mafia or gangs in general, it's the code of the streets. You don't snitch. No matter what is happening, no matter what type of trouble you might be, you don't snitch. You don't snitch. And so when looking at the mafia's code of silence, it's called omerta. And omerta stands for silence or manliness. And generally speaking, omerta is this wonderful commitment to loyalty and secrecy. It is often regarded as the main code, the core principle of the mafia. Anyone that is going to be a member of the mafia, anyone that is going to be a member of the mob, must swear to secrecy. What happens here stays here. It's like Vegas. Hey, like my hat. What happens here stays here. And with John Gotti compared to Al Capone, Gotti loved the attention. He loved talking to the cameras. He loved talking to the media. He loved being in newspapers and on magazines. He loved the fame and camaraderie. And ultimately, that was his downfall. That was his downfall. And, what it teaches you is you keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. That's the other thing. Well, in this case, he should have really kept his friends a little bit closer because clearly Sammy the Bull had enough, and when he heard John Gotti disparaging him on that wiretap, he flipped and told everything, and the federal government got him. But while some would say Sammy the Bull is a snitch, he's once a snitch, he'll always be a snitch. While Sammy the Bull may have to look over his shoulder, even though he's much older, because John Gotti was convicted back in the 90s, he perished in 2002. Truth be told, Sammy the Bull, anyone who breaks this code of silence, they will always be labeled as, you guessed it, a rat. Not a snake, not a mosquito, not a roach, not any other pest. They will be labeled as a rat. And so you know what they say when it comes to snitches? There's an old saying, you can say it out loud when you're watching this: snitches get stitches. If you snitch, you will be dealt with. If you're a rat, you really will be dealt with. And generally speaking, to sum it all up, you will more than likely find yourself sleeping with the fishes. So again, I want to thank you so much for joining. Thank you for tuning in for this part 2 of Mafia, which, remember, was Masters at Finding Incredible Assassins. Mafia, from Capone to the Teflon Don, with love. Thank you so much for tuning. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Go ahead and put some questions in the comments. You know, I like to read the comments, so I can go ahead, and if you put something in there, I'd love to answer your question. Communicate with people who may be around the world. But as always, stay tuned for the next lecture. Thank you for listening. God bless.